There is a reason August 14th may seem to carry a different emotional weight today, but it is not because a square on a calendar has the authority to command your destiny. And it is not because some hidden message from the universe has been encoded into a particular date. Sometimes a date matters for a much more human reason. It gives you a moment to pause long enough to see yourself without the usual distractions. And when that happens, the date becomes a mirror. What appears in that mirror can be uncomfortable because it may reveal something you have sensed quietly for a very long time but have not wanted to admit. So before you move any further, I want you to consider one question with complete honesty. What if the version of yourself you have spent years defending, protecting, and preserving is actually the version you are finally ready to let go of? Sit with that for a moment. Do not immediately think about the people who disappeared from your life. Do not focus on the decisions you regret or the mistakes you wish you could rewrite. Look deeper than that. Look at the identity you constructed when life became difficult. Look at the emotional armor you created because you needed something strong enough to carry you through experiences that felt too heavy to process at the time. You may have called that armor strength. You may have called it independence. You may have called it being realistic. You may have even convinced yourself that it was simply who you were. But what if it was never supposed to be your permanent residence? What if it was only a shelter you built during a storm, and now you are standing inside that shelter long after the sky has begun to clear? This is what makes today meaningful. We are not talking about magic controlling your choices, and we are not talking about fate sitting somewhere outside of you, secretly arranging every detail of your existence. We are talking about something far more intimate. We are talking about you, the part of you that exists underneath the exhaustion, underneath the fear, underneath the disappointment, and underneath all those years when surviving required you to become someone different from the person you naturally were. There is a quieter version of you beneath all of that, and perhaps that person has been waiting patiently for you to stop confusing survival with identity. By the time you reach the end of this reflection, you may begin to understand why certain things are disappearing from your life right now, and why some losses may actually be making room for a chapter that could not begin while you were still carrying everything from the previous one. Stay with this thought, because what comes next may force you to look at your own history in a completely different way. There is a truth many people discover far too late. The person you had to become in order to survive difficult circumstances is not necessarily the person you were meant to remain. Think about your own story. Perhaps there was a moment when someone wounded you deeply and afterward you became quieter. Maybe you had plenty to say, but you had already experienced what it felt like to speak honestly and discover that your words did not change the situation. Eventually, silence became easier than explaining yourself again. You may have started keeping certain feelings private, not because those feelings were insignificant, but because you learned that revealing them to the wrong person could leave you feeling even more exposed. Perhaps another chapter of your life turned you into someone fiercely self-sufficient. You became the person who handles everything without asking for assistance, the person who says that everything is fine, the person who would rather struggle privately than risk depending on someone who might eventually disappoint you. That independence may look admirable from the outside, but perhaps it was not entirely born from freedom. Perhaps it grew from repeated experiences that taught you dependence could come with a painful price. Maybe you became someone who explains yourself constantly. In relationships, friendships, professional situations, and ordinary conversations, you may find yourself giving reasons for every decision, defending every boundary, and trying to make certain that everyone understands why you feel the way you do. You may spend enormous amounts of energy proving your value to people who never seem to wonder whether they have earned the privilege of having you in their lives. You may have learned to make yourself understandable because somewhere along the way, being misunderstood felt dangerous. And perhaps you also became skilled at hiding your pain. You smile when you are overwhelmed. You continue the conversation when something inside you is breaking. You walk into rooms carrying private sadness while presenting everyone with a version of yourself that looks composed. Sometimes that happens because vulnerability was once met with rejection, judgment, dismissal, or indifference. Eventually, keeping everything together can begin to feel safer than allowing anyone to see what is really happening beneath the surface. There may also have been places where you accepted less than you genuinely wanted. You may have tolerated less affection in love, less recognition in your work, and less loyalty in friendship because some hidden part of you associated asking for more with the possibility of losing what little you already had. That fear can be incredibly powerful. It can convince a person to remain in familiar circumstances even when those circumstances are slowly draining the life out of them. You tell yourself that something is better than nothing. You tell yourself that you should be grateful. You tell yourself that perhaps things would eventually change. And without realizing it, you begin shrinking your desires so that your surroundings no longer have to change. None of this means you were weak. In fact, the opposite may be true. The version of you that made those choices was responding to what life had taught you. That person found a way to keep moving when stopping would have felt impossible. That person got through mornings that seemed too heavy to begin, entered rooms that felt emotionally unsafe, endured relationships where the emotional exchange was painfully unequal, and continued functioning through periods when simply getting through the day required more strength than anyone around you could see. You should not hate that version of yourself. You should understand that version of yourself. You should recognize what it accomplished for you. But there comes a moment when gratitude for your survival must become permission to live differently, because surviving and living are not identical experiences. A behavior that protected you when you were younger may become restrictive when your circumstances change. The emotional distance that once prevented you from being hurt may later prevent genuine intimacy. The habit of doing everything alone may eventually stop you from receiving support. The constant need to explain yourself may keep you trapped in relationships where you feel you must earn the right to be understood. The walls that once gave you security can eventually become walls that block the very life you want to experience. Consider the difference between protection and confinement. From the inside, they can look remarkably similar. Both involve walls. Both create distance. Both can make you feel secure. But one gives you time to heal, while the other prevents you from moving forward. This is why releasing an old identity does not mean rejecting the person you used to be. It means recognizing that the conditions that created that identity may no longer define your present reality. It is like carrying protective armor long after the battle has ended. The armor once served a purpose. It absorbed impact. It helped you stay standing. But eventually, its weight becomes part of the problem. You cannot move freely while carrying protection that is no longer necessary. That is where August 14th can become meaningful. Not as a supernatural command, but as a symbolic checkpoint. Human beings have always created moments like this. A new year can become a dividing line. A birthday can make you reflect on who you have been and who you are becoming. An anniversary of loss can bring old emotions back into awareness. The date itself does not need mystical power to matter. What matters is what the date allows you to recognize. We often need a marker because transformation can be difficult to see while it is happening. We need a moment that lets us say, "This part of the story has brought me here, but I do not have to carry every part of it forward." August 14th can serve as that kind of internal line in the sand. It can become the point where you stop endlessly negotiating with the identity that was built around fear. Think about how exhausting that negotiation has been. Perhaps every day contains some version of the same private argument. Am I allowed to say no? Am I allowed to establish a boundary without feeling guilty? Am I allowed to want more than what I have been given? Am I allowed to leave something that no longer reflects who I am becoming? Am I allowed to choose myself without needing to construct a defense for that choice? Those questions can consume more energy than you realize. They keep you mentally circling the same decision, waiting for permission that may never come from another person. And perhaps the deeper realization waiting for you today is that you may not need anyone else to approve the next version of your life. The fear-based identity does not disappear because you force it away. It begins to loosen when you finally understand that its job has been completed. That realization can feel both liberating and frightening because familiar pain can sometimes feel safer than unfamiliar freedom. You know how to survive the old pattern because you have practiced it for years. The new path asks you to trust yourself in ways you may not have trusted yourself before. That is why this moment can feel like a turning point. Not because August 14th is magically deciding your future, but because you are finally willing to look directly at the part of yourself that has been making decisions from fear. And once you can see that clearly, the question changes. You are no longer asking whether you can continue being the person who survived everything. You are beginning to ask who you might become when survival is no longer the only goal. That recognition opens the door to the next part of this journey, because once you understand what the old version of you was protecting, you can finally begin to understand what it has been preventing you from becoming. That constant inner debate can quietly consume years of your life, because you may not even notice how often you are sitting before an invisible judge, presenting evidence for choices you have not yet allowed yourself to make. You replay conversations, imagine other people's reactions, question whether you are being selfish, wonder whether you are asking for too much, and then return to the same familiar place because uncertainty feels more frightening than dissatisfaction. A true symbolic reset begins when you recognize that you do not have to keep carrying identities simply because they once helped you survive. Some versions of you were created from necessity, but necessity does not last forever. You can release an outdated identity without rejecting the person who carried it. You can look back with compassion and finally tell yourself that you did the best you could with the awareness, strength, and emotional resources you had at the time. Real self-forgiveness is not pretending that nothing happened. It is refusing to keep punishing yourself for how you responded when you were simply trying to get through something you did not yet know how to handle. It also means accepting what cannot be changed. Your past cannot be edited. Certain people cannot be made into different people, and some opportunities will never return in the exact form you wanted them to. But acceptance can stop yesterday from taking resources that belong to tomorrow. You begin to notice how much energy has been tied up in wishing reality had been different, and slowly you begin bringing that energy home to yourself. You loosen your dependence on approval. You stop checking every decision against someone else's expectations. You begin choosing your response instead of automatically repeating the reaction that once protected you. This is not about pretending your history never happened. It is about recognizing that a chapter can be meaningful without remaining unfinished forever. And if you are wondering whether this internal shift is actually happening inside you, there are 7 subtle signs worth noticing. They are not dramatic announcements. They often appear quietly through ordinary moments, small reactions, changing preferences, and decisions that would have felt impossible for an older version of you. The first sign is that places where you once felt comfortable no longer feel right. This can be confusing because nothing may have obviously changed on the surface. You may walk into the same workplace, sit with the same people, follow the same routine, and yet something inside you feels different. A job that once seemed acceptable can suddenly feel restrictive, as though every day is asking you to become smaller. A friendship that once felt effortless may begin to feel strangely uneven, with you giving more attention, understanding, patience, and emotional effort than you receive. Even a routine that once gave you security may begin to feel like a cage disguised as familiarity. You might wonder whether you are becoming difficult, ungrateful, restless, or impossible to satisfy. But sometimes discomfort is not evidence that you are broken. Sometimes it is the emotional evidence that you have outgrown the environment around you. Growth can make an old life feel strangely tight. The room may not have changed, but you have. The second sign is that you are becoming increasingly careful about where your energy goes. Perhaps there was a time when your automatic answer was yes. You said yes because you felt guilty. You said yes because you did not want anyone to be disappointed. You said yes because refusing felt unsafe, uncomfortable, or selfish. You may have accepted invitations you did not want, responsibilities you did not have the capacity for, and emotional burdens that belonged to other people. But something is shifting now. Before answering, you pause. You consider the cost. You ask whether this deserves your attention, your time, your emotional presence, or your effort. That pause is important. It does not mean your heart has become harder. It can mean you are finally learning that generosity without limits can become self-abandonment. You are beginning to understand that your energy is not unlimited and that protecting it is not an act of cruelty. It is the beginning of a healthier relationship with yourself. Boundaries often feel uncomfortable at first because the old version of you was trained to measure goodness by how much you could tolerate. Now you are learning to measure maturity by how honestly you can choose. The third sign is one that can feel surprisingly liberating. You are beginning to lose the urge to explain yourself to everyone. There is a major difference between communicating clearly and constantly defending your right to make your own decisions. Perhaps you once felt compelled to explain every choice, every change, every boundary, and every departure. If you changed careers, you needed everyone to understand why. If you left a relationship, you felt pressured to provide a complete case file. If you needed distance, you worried that someone would interpret it as rejection. But gradually, something inside you becomes quieter. You realize that people are allowed to misunderstand you. You realize that not every decision requires a public defense. You can say that this is what you have decided, and you can allow the sentence to stand on its own. That does not mean you no longer care about people. It means you are no longer making their agreement a requirement for your peace. The fourth sign appears through your relationships, and this one requires honesty because it can be easy to misunderstand what is happening. You may suddenly notice that certain relationships feel different. Conversations that once seemed natural may feel exhausting. Patterns you previously tolerated may now feel impossible to ignore. You may have less patience for emotional games, inconsistency, manipulation, or dynamics where you are constantly required to prove your loyalty, but this does not necessarily mean that some mysterious force is removing people from your life. The reality is more personal. As you change, your needs change, your tolerance changes, your understanding of respect changes, your capacity for certain emotional patterns changes. Some people will grow alongside you, and some relationships may no longer fit the person you are becoming. That does not automatically make anyone the villain. Sometimes growth simply changes the shape of connection. A relationship can have been meaningful and still no longer be right for your present life. The fifth sign is perhaps one of the most revealing. You begin wanting peace more than attention. There may have been a period when being noticed mattered deeply. You wanted to be chosen, admired, validated, pursued, recognized, and reassured. Attention could temporarily make you feel significant. Being chosen could quiet an old insecurity. Intensity could feel like proof that something mattered. But now your desires may be changing in a quieter direction. You begin imagining a peaceful home and feeling more excited by that than by constant excitement. You want an ordinary Tuesday without emotional turbulence. You want relationships where you do not have to decode every message or wonder where you stand. You want stability that does not require you to sacrifice yourself. You want calm because your nervous system has finally grown tired of confusing chaos with passion. That desire is not evidence that your life has become dull. It can be evidence that something inside you is healing. You are learning that love does not have to hurt constantly to be meaningful, and intensity does not automatically equal depth. The sixth sign is that your past can still hurt, but it no longer has the same authority over your choices. This is where genuine healing becomes different from the fantasy of healing. You do not wake up one morning and discover that every painful memory has disappeared. That promise would be unrealistic. Certain memories may still bring sadness. Certain names may still carry emotional weight. Certain experiences may still make your chest tighten when you remember them. But the difference is what happens afterward. The memory appears, and you do not automatically let it determine your next decision. You can remember what happened without rebuilding your entire future around avoiding the possibility of it happening again. You can acknowledge the wound without allowing the wound to become the author of your identity. That is a profound shift. The pain may still exist, but the pain is no longer holding the steering wheel. The seventh sign reaches even deeper because it concerns what you begin expecting from yourself. You start wanting more, but not necessarily in the way you once did. You are not simply craving more attention, more approval, or more evidence that other people value you. You begin wanting greater discipline. You want better health. You want greater financial stability. You want relationships that actually carry meaning. You want your daily behavior to resemble the life you keep saying you desire. There is a new kind of hunger developing inside you, and instead of exhausting you with endless comparison, it begins motivating you toward action. You look at your days and realize that your future cannot be built only from wishes. It requires choices, habits, discipline, and alignment. The desire itself becomes a signal that you are ready to participate in your own transformation, rather than waiting for circumstances to change first. And if you recognized yourself in even 2 or 3 of these signs, stop for a moment and breathe. You do not need to force a dramatic transformation tonight. You do not need to become a completely different person by tomorrow. Perhaps the deeper awakening is much simpler and much more honest. Perhaps you are not being asked to invent a new identity at all. Perhaps you are finally becoming honest enough to admit what you have always wanted, who you have always wanted to become, and what parts of your old identity no longer belong in the life you are preparing to live. And once that realization settles in, there is one deeper question waiting for you, because recognizing that your old identity is falling away is only the beginning of understanding what your life is asking you to choose next. If you're ready to stop living from fear, go ahead and comment, "I choose myself." Let that be the first honest thing you do today. Now, here's the part most people skip over because it's not as comfortable to talk about. Becoming your most powerful self doesn't feel powerful the entire time. Some of it feels like loss. There can be loneliness in this process, the strange, quiet loneliness of outgrowing people before you've replaced them with anyone new. There can be uncertainty, especially in the early mornings when old habits whisper that the change isn't worth it. You might question beliefs you were raised with. You might feel misunderstood by people who knew the old version of you and preferred it because the old version was easier to manage, easier to predict. And sometimes, strangely, you might even miss the old version of yourself. Not because that version was healthy, but because it was familiar. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar peace, simply because we know its shape. I want to be very clear about something here, though. Growth does not require you to burn your life down. It doesn't require you to abandon everyone who knew you before. It doesn't require dramatic, destructive gestures to prove you've changed. Real transformation is quieter than that. It looks like healthier choices, clearer boundaries, and decisions made from intention instead of fear. Sometimes hardest goodbye isn't to another person. It's to the version of yourself you created just to survive them. If you're standing at the edge of a new chapter right now, even if you're scared, go ahead and comment, "I am ready." So, let's talk about what power actually means, because I think most of us were given the wrong definition somewhere along the way. Power is not controlling other people, it's not revenge, and it's not proving anyone wrong. Power is not becoming cold or pretending you don't care, or building walls so high that nothing can touch you, good or bad. Here's what real power actually looks like. It looks like emotional control. Not suppressing what you feel, but choosing how you respond to what you feel. It looks like self-respect, the quiet decision to stop settling for less than you know you deserve. It looks like discipline, showing up for yourself even on the days when no one is watching and nothing feels urgent. It looks like patience, understanding that meaningful change takes longer than we want it to, and being willing to stay the course anyway. It looks like boundaries, the ability to say no without guilt and yes without fear. It looks like knowing when to walk away from something that's no longer serving you, and just as importantly, knowing when to stay and fight for something worth fighting for. It looks like choosing peace over chaos, even when chaos feels more familiar. It looks like trusting yourself again after years of doubting your own judgment. And maybe most powerfully of all, it looks like keeping the promises you make to yourself. The small ones. The ones nobody else will ever know about. That is what strength actually looks like. Quiet, steady, unshakable, not loud, not performative, just real. Now I want to give you something practical, something you can actually do today to make this more than just a video you watched and forgot about by tomorrow. I call this the August 14th release and rebuild practice. It's simple. It's grounded. It's not a supernatural ritual. It's a reflection exercise, the kind therapists and journaling coaches have recommended for years, just applied intentionally to this date. Find a few quiet minutes today. Get a piece of paper or open a note on your phone if that's easier, and answer 5 questions honestly, without editing yourself. Question 1. What am I ready to stop carrying? Question 2. What version of myself am I ready to release? Question 3. What boundary do I need to create, and who is it for? Question 4. What habit, if I started it today, would make me respect myself more? Question 5. What kind of person do I want to become over the next 90 days? Once you've written your answers, I want you to write one final sentence and really mean it as you write it. I release what no longer represents me. I choose what helps me become stronger, wiser, calmer, and more intentional. That's it. No candles required, no ceremony, just honesty written down on a day you chose to make meaningful. Before we get to the ending, I want to remind you of something because I think you need to hear it plainly without any poetic language wrapped around it. You are not behind. There is no invisible finish line that everyone else has already crossed while you are busy surviving. You are not too old to start something new. You are not too damaged to be loved well. You are not disqualified from a better life because your past was messy, complicated, or full of decisions you wish you could take back. You can make different choices starting today. You can rebuild slowly, one honest decision at a time. You can begin again, not from scratch because nothing you've lived through was wasted, but from everything you've learned. The strongest version of you does not need to arrive overnight. It doesn't require a dramatic before and after. It begins with one honest decision made quietly, and then another, until one day you look up and realize you've become someone you no longer have to force yourself to be. You just are. So, let's slow down here for these final moments. Maybe August 14th isn't the day your life magically changes. Maybe it's the day you finally decide that your life deserves a different version of you. The old you served a purpose. Please hear that. The old you got you through things most people will never understand. The old you protected you when you had no one else to lean on. So honor that version of yourself. Thank them for surviving. But don't force them to lead you into a future they were never designed to build. Your next chapter doesn't need the old you. It needs the healed version of you, the courageous version, the disciplined, patient, boundaried, and powerful version of you, the one you've been quietly becoming all along, even on the days you couldn't see it. If this message found you at exactly the right moment, go ahead and write it below. The old me is not my future. And when you're ready, not perfect, not fully healed, just ready, take the first honest step. The rest of your life is waiting.